This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Hey, welcome to the end of history and this final episode of our series entitled The 6 Years That Made the Modern Middle East. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host here at the End of History podcast. We've been looking at how we got to the mess where we are today, how the Middle East became a place that we associate, at least in the modern Western mind, with violence, terrorism, backwardness. I think probably that's beyond the Western mind. That's probably a global perspective. And I know all that sounds pretty disrespectful, particularly if you're from the Middle East. And I certainly don't mean to be disrespectful, not my intent at all. But this is the factual reality of the way many in the Western world, and like I say, probably around the world, that's the way it's viewed, right? You'll hear statements like, those people in that area of the world have always been fighting each other. You'll hear things like that. Hopefully, by this point in this series, if you've followed along, you know that isn't true. It's really, really far from what's true. But as the Western world has come to dominate in the region, this became the story of the new modern Middle East. That's the story that we're familiar with. We started in this series in 1919 with the formation of the modern Middle East at the Paris Peace Conference. That followed there at World War I, a little over 100 years ago. It was here that the Western powers established mandates and the boundaries for future nations built around Western interests, not Middle Eastern interests or cultures or values, but around Western interests. Then in episode 2, we looked at 1948. And of course, the most notorious event of that year was the creation of the State of Israel. But this was also the year that nationalism came to the region. Throughout the region, for better or for worse, it wasn't just in Israel. It was already booming, nationalism was. So the fruit of nationalism began to blossom from Egypt to Iran and that region of the world. And it was a promise, nationalism was, it was a promise of political freedom that wasn't fulfilled as things turned out. Well, in the next episode, we looked at 1967. That was one of the pivotal years that helped shape the modern Middle East. This was the year of the 1967 Six Days War there in Israel, right? Now, I've tried to be really careful to not make this a podcast series about Israel or about American foreign policy in the Middle East, but that's the year, 1967 was, where these two things really merged in a definitive way. After 1967, it became a lot harder to distinguish U.S. and Israeli policy in the Middle East from one another. And those shared interests had a destabilizing effect in the region, which also produced its own responses and counter-responses. And then that brought us, of course, to 1979. Our next episode in the series, the year of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the year that marked the end of political hopes in the Middle East and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism as a replacement for those hopes. Rather than democracy or even communism, people throughout the region, they began setting their focus on Islam. Now, this, of course, gave rise to radicals and extremism throughout the region, from Lebanon to Iran, and even Syria to Iraq. And then in the last episode we've done in this series, we came to 2003 and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That was when things really began to fall apart. It's crazy to look back because, believe it or not, there were actually a lot of audacious hopes for what that invasion of Iraq would mean for the region. Many experts, many commentators, particularly U.S. strategy designers, they thought the U.S. invasion of Iraq, that it would bring democracy to the Middle East. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. That invasion was like a virus that spread throughout the region with different effects and counter effects that created new crises, produced new upheavals, and full of unintended consequences. So now we come to 2011. This is our final episode in this series, our final year that looks at the rise and fall of the modern Middle East. Now, I'll tell you, the original concept for this series, this podcast series, came before the October 7th, 2023 attacks by Hamas in Israel. And of course, all of the devastation that followed that. And I've wondered since then, should 2023 be the year we look at in this series? I don't think so. All right. Although we still don't know what all the effects that will roll out from 2023, I still see 2011 as far more significant. Without 2011, the events that began ramping up the tensions in the region that year, there really wouldn't have been a 2023. The situations that got us to 2011 and beyond that, they wouldn't have allowed for a Hamas that looked and behaved the way it did in 2023. It wouldn't have allowed for Iran as such a consistent threat to Israel in the region of the Middle East. 2011 was pivotal. Israel and Iran haven't gotten along since 1979, of course, but before 2011, Iran was more of a nuisance, not a real threat, not a legitimate threat. That began to change in 2011. After 2011, the idea of the U.S. or Russia or China or anyone really being able to control the region, that began to collapse. And I realize that the regional players themselves should be the ones controlling their fate, but one of the underlying points throughout this series is that the creation of the modern Middle East was never designed to be truly self-governing. It was always designed with possibly subtle but definite priority toward the interests of the great powers, whoever that was at the time, being the ones who were best served by what happened in the Middle East. That's really the true story of this region. As I'm recording this, there's a major regional war between Israel and Iran that really appears to be right on the verge of happening. Israel has just assassinated a leader of Hamas who was in Iran attending the inauguration of the country's new president. Now, this was only the most recent ratcheting up of tensions between these two powers. And you add to that growing likelihood of a war between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon. This week in Israel, they also bombed Beirut. And then, of course, you have ongoing conflict and the atrocities in Gaza. It just appears that everything is trending toward a wider war, a worsening of a conflict that's already pretty bad. And one of the headlines that came out of the New York Times just in this past week, it said, fears of wider Middle East conflict deepen, with U.S. seen as not in control. That phrase, not in control, is in quotes. That reality right there is something that didn't exist and would never have been acknowledged in prior decades. In the 1970s, when Egypt and Syria, if you'll remember from this series earlier, when they invaded Israel, it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union who held back the tide. That was the same thing in 1967. Way back in 1948, when war was surging, it was the great powers operating through the United Nations that brought an end to the conflict. In 1919, it was the great powers that set everything down. Even in 2003, as the U.S. invaded Iraq, they did so because they had the power, the easy power, to do so. But it's all different now. And the biggest difference, the greatest concern, is that as the conflict continues to grow in the Middle East today, we're now in a new spot. We're in a new situation that never existed before in the history of the modern Middle East. Now, the great powers don't have the influence to stop the violence, the legitimacy to promote peace or democracy, the credibility to be heard really at all. It's not hard from this vantage point to see how a regional war is not only possible, but could very quickly and easily turn to what we might call a world war in the history books. Now, I'm going to come back to that later on in this episode. For now, it's important to know that this all began, its most recent iteration of chaos, in 2011. That was the year of what many commentators call the Arab Spring. It's the year that the Syrian civil war began. It's the year the U.S. withdrew from Iraq. It was the year that ISIS began its spread from Iraq to Syria. So let's step back for just a minute and let's review how we got to 2011. This wasn't destiny. This could have gone a different direction. I want to look to a few of the significant things that occurred throughout the region of the Middle East that brought us to 2011. So first off, you have the Second Intifada. Now, you'll probably remember that phrase, that word, that term, the Second Intifada, from earlier in the 1980s. Remember, we had the First Intifada way back then. So in the 1980s, that was the channel that facilitated the rise of Hamas in the occupied territories. The second Intifada began in September of 2000. Palestinians actually refer to this as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. So the peace process of the 1990s had proven to be a lot of talk, but not a lot of action from the Palestinian point of view. So there was this growing resentment among the Palestinians by the end of the 1990s. Amid that resentment, this Israeli politician, Ariel Sharon, now he would end up becoming the prime minister, but he was infamous among the Palestinians before this time for the part he played in a massacre of civilians during the Lebanon wars, right? Well, September 2000 comes. Sharon, he's a politician by this point in his life, in history. He marches to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. He brings a whole crowd with him, including about 1,000 security guards, and he defiantly declares that, contrary to what the Palestinians may believe or what they may have been told, the Temple Mount belongs to Israel. Now, for those who don't know, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the Temple Mount. But Sharon goes on to say, the Temple Mount belongs to Israel, it will always belong to Israel, and they'll never give that up. Well, that act of provocation is the spark that lights the fire of the Second Intifada. Not just his statements, but his movement into the Al-Aqsa Intifada, around the Al-Aqsa Intifada with his 1,000 security guards. Uprising and protests, they began to spread throughout the occupied territories. Israel carries out targeted killings. They fired more than 1 million rounds of rubber bullets on protesters within the first few weeks of this uprising. The Palestinians, for their part, they amped up the violence with suicide bombings on various targets throughout Israel, particularly on civilian targets. The Palestinian response seemed far more violent in the Second Intifada than it did in the first one. The Second Intifada continued through to 2005. By that time, Sharon was the prime minister of Israel, and nothing had really been gained on either side. But during that time, what did we see? We saw the 9/11 attacks and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So the region was changing, as were the dynamics, even as the Second Intifada was going on. But the big shocker came in 2006. That's when the Palestinians conducted their own elections. Now, these elections were the second round of elections. The first ones were held in the 1990s, and it was all supposed to be part of the roadmap for peace and the two-state solutions that the peacemakers way back in the 90s had drawn out, right? Well, the Intifada is wrapped up, the elections are held, and guess who wins? Hamas wins. In fact, the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, he was empowered to form a government there among the Palestinians, and he now became the official leader of the Palestinian people. Now, if that name, Ismail Haniyeh, if that sounds familiar, it probably should. He's the leader of Hamas that was assassinated by Israel in July, last week, as I'm recording this, while he was attending the new president's inauguration in Iran. So this is kind of a big deal in 2006, all right? In the span of 20 years, Hamas had gone from being a small-time player in Palestinian resistance to now being elected as the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. And for a second time, just the briefest of seconds, it looked like this might actually be a game-changing situation. Hamas's charter, it talks about the eradication of Israel. But now the leaders of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh specifically, he talked about a willingness to work with Israel. They put a plug on anti-Israeli speech that they normally relied upon. And so the question was, could this be the game changer to make the Palestinians feel both heard, legitimized, while at the same time causing a group that was previously understood as a terrorist organization to go legitimate, right? Well, we'll never know that. We'll never know the answer to that question because the U.S., they poured in more than $2 million into the occupations during the elections to support the candidates that they wanted to work with. But now, in the middle of a war in Iraq and the war on terrorism, they're not about to work with Hamas. Ariel Sharon was also adamant he would never work with Hamas. So whatever potential this surprising election might have held for the future of the conflict, it disintegrated real quick. This would be the beginning of, it would end up being the last Palestinian election to date so far. Hamas was ostracized, funding was cut off, and the fate of the Palestinian people continued to worsen. Well, the Palestinian people, they saw themselves and the whole thing as just pointless. Democracy worked, but only if you chose the candidates and the parties that the occupying forces demanded you choose. Now it looked like the only way they could have a voice was through violence. That was the only thing that worked in this conflict from what they saw. That's what was going on in Palestine during this time, all right, in Israel and the Palestinian territories. But it wasn't the only thing that could have gone differently. There was also a brief chance for another way in Iran during this time period. By the end of the 90s, the Islamic Revolution, the subsequent republic, it was 20 years old, and frankly, it wasn't doing too well. Being a pariah for the rest of the world was not good for the economy. It was pretty much bad for everything else as well, for the country's well-being. Khomeini was dead. The religious establishment still ruled. It still ruled the show in Iran. But slowly but surely, there was this rising voice of moderation that was beginning to be heard in Iran. And when I say moderate, I mean moderate by Iranian standards. These guys weren't progressives by the Western liberal sense of the word, but they represented a small but growing group of people who thought there might be another route forward for the country, separate from the excesses of the most recent Iranian history, right? Well, the most prominent of these voices was a guy named Mohammad Khatami. In 1997, he was elected to the presidency of Iran on a platform of liberalization and reforms. And it seemed that the people themselves were ready for a change. Well, Khatami talked about a dialogue among civilizations. That meant he was willing to work with the U.S., maybe even Israel. As president, he pushed for freedoms in Iran, like freedom of expression, tolerance, civil society, free markets, along with better relations with other countries. All the language that Western democracies wanted to hear, right? Those moves popularized Khatami on the world stage, and many even among many within his own country. But it made him a focused target, dangerously made him a focused target among the extremists and the hardliners that remained in Iran. Well, that pressure continued to mount as the new century started. Well, then, of course, in 2001 came the 9/11 terror attacks in the U.S., and the next year, January 2002, U.S. President George W. Bush gave his famous Axis of Evil speech, right? That little snippet is in the intro to this episode, the Axis of Evil speech, and he lists Iran as one of the targets in America's new war on terrorism. Whatever goodwill Khatami had built up within Iran, whatever hopes for possible changes going forward, well, they were erased with that speech. Meanwhile, that speech was like oxygen for the hardliners in Iran, those who would always oppose and see the U.S. as the great Satan. Within 3 years, Khatami was voted out of office, and the hardliner, Ahmadinejad, he came to office. Those who follow the region, you'll be familiar with his voice and with that name. From the outside looking in, American policy and practice in the Middle East, it really didn't make any sense. No sense at all. To be honest, I'm not totally persuaded it made any sense at all from those on the inside looking out. This is the last superpower that remains after the Cold War. Europe can kind of check its advances as far as credibility goes, but everyone knows the U.S. can do just about whatever they want on the world stage at this point in history. But rather than fostering change, rather than pushing for democracy or anything like that, the U.S. seemed cornered by fear and irrational thought after the 2001 September attacks. They said they wanted democracy in the Middle East, but only if the candidates they chose were the ones who won. That's the way the Palestinians saw it anyway. What was the difference in that approach than the excesses of the CIA coups and sponsored assassinations in the 1950s and 60s? They went out of their way in Iran to ostracize any hope for change. In Saudi Arabia, an ally of the U.S., things hardly made any more sense. Saudi Arabia and its royal family were notorious for their corruption, their authoritarianism, but the U.S. seemed bound to their side. And that was particularly strange because if we're looking at 9/11, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The guy that led the organization that sponsored the terror attacks, he was Saudi. Why was the U.S. so easily provoked against everyone else in the Middle East, but so defiantly aligned with the Saudis? Was it really just about oil? Was it all the talk about democracy and freedom? Nothing more than a smokescreen. In 2002, there was this famous incident in Saudi Arabia that kind of highlighted the perversity of America's alliance with the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Keep in mind, this was post 9/11 when the U.S. was hyper-focused on opposing terrorism, reshaping the Middle East, supposedly. Well, this fire started at a girls' school in that country. 15 girls burned to death. But they could have easily escaped, except the religious police in Saudi Arabia wouldn't let them out because they weren't wearing the proper headscarves to cover themselves. This was an American ally? Keep in mind, all of this was going on in the background too. Second Intifada, Iran, Saudi Arabia. The big story wasn't there, all right? The big story in the Middle East was still the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the resulting occupation in the war. We talked about this in the last episode, but that one started off seemingly easy. The U.S. invaded. Saddam Hussein's regime, it was toppled. Saddam Hussein was hung. And now, what's going to happen? Well, apparently, the U.S. hadn't planned that far ahead, right? Not long after the war began, after the initial calm of America's victory in Iraq, an insurgency began. And the insurgency unleashed all kinds of hell against the U.S. military, but also against Iraqis. And it facilitated the rekindling of those old historical divisions within the Iraqi nation. So by 2011, the Middle East was in a pretty bad state. There wasn't any help coming, not from within or from without. And this is where the collapse of the Middle East really begins. Seriously, that's what I think the history books will tell in future decades, the collapse of the Middle East. In 2018, Adam McKay, he made a movie called Vice about the life of Dick Cheney. Now, I usually like most of McKay's movies. His movie, The Big Short, it's a classic as far as I'm concerned. But this one, Vice, I wasn't a big fan. I remember watching it in the theater around Christmas time and seeing all these images of the Middle East that were attributed to Dick Cheney, the rise of ISIS, the fall of Iraq, collapse of the Arab Spring. On it went. But the problem was, a lot of these things happened not on Dick Cheney's watch or on George W. Bush's watch. They happened during President Obama's tenure as president, all right? The Bush Republican administration certainly helped start the chaos, but the Democratic administrations, they did their own parts by making bad situations even worse. Now, of course, I've tried to keep this series I didn't want it to be about U.S. policy. I didn't want it to be just about Israel or anything besides the story of the Middle East. But by the time we get to 2011, that becomes a lot more difficult because the U.S. did so much damage in 2011 and played such a big hand in what transpired afterwards. And this wasn't like right or wrong decisions necessarily. I'm not saying that. By the time Obama took office, by the time his administration began its efforts in the Middle East, there really weren't any right or good moves left. It was more a matter of how much damage they could prevent from happening. And honestly, I think they probably made the wrong decisions in many of those instances, but I suppose the history books will, that'll end up telling the real stories. But we've got to start with the Arab Spring. That, of course, didn't begin in the Middle East, but in North Africa, spread east into Egypt, then to Syria, and for a while even towards Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The Arab Spring, it was this popular uprising among the people of the region who wanted and demanded democracy and freedom. Actually, that's not what it was, all right? That's what it was sold as in the Western media. We can't seem to escape our Disney type of narratives of good guys and bad guys, happy endings as for American ideals when we look at the world. The Arab Spring was about people being fed up. It was about people not having jobs, not having money to feed their kids, not having enough food. It was about people who went to school, obeyed the rules and the West had taught them, but they still ended up stuck in poverty under brutal hands of oppression, hands that were usually backed and supported by the U.S. It consisted of magnificent images. If you pay attention to the region again, you'll remember the protests in Tahrir Square there in Egypt, the 24-hour news coverage of democratic uprisings there. Remember Tunisia, Yemen, Libya. And everyone said it was the breakout of democracy in the Middle East. But we never learn our lessons about these false narratives. You've got to be careful when you watch protesters in Arabic-speaking countries holding protest signs in these images on CNN, and those protest signs are written in English. Those signs aren't for the leaders or for their countrymen. They're made for a Western, usually American audience. And that usually suggests there's something else going on in the country itself, something not being understood on CNN. A few years ago, there was a series in the New York Times on all of this. And I just want to pull a quote from that article, from that series actually, and that talks about what was going on in the region at this time. Okay, I'm going to put a link to the actual series itself in the show notes of this episode. But the series says by 2011, any Egyptian younger than 41, and that was roughly 75% of the population, had only ever known two heads of state, while a Syrian of the same age had lived his or her entire life under the control of the father and son Assad dynasty. Along with political stasis in many Arab nations, most levers of economic power lay in the hands of small oligarchies or aristocratic families. For everyone else, about the only path to financial security was to wrangle a job within fantastically bloated public sector bureaucracies, government agencies that were often themselves monuments to nepotism and corruption. While the sheer amount of money pouring into oil-rich, sparsely populated nations like Libya or Kuwait might allow for a degree of economic trickle-down prosperity, this was not the case in more populous but resource-poor nations like Egypt or Syria, where poverty and underemployment were severe and, given the ongoing regional population explosion, ever-worsening problems. End of quote. So throughout the region, this was happening, right? You have leaders empowered either through oppression or through U.S. dollars and military might, sometimes a combination of all of the above. And you have this tier of leadership ruling over the people. And the leadership is hollow. It's got power behind it, but that power, it's not native. It's not real. It's not from the people they rule over. Sometimes it's even against the very interests of the people they rule over. But it can't be undone. For decades, this setup was impenetrable. The elite, the power-holding class was untouchable, but also it had no incentive to do anything for the betterment of the country and the people. Meanwhile, the people they ruled over were frustrated, they're resentful, but there wasn't any sort of real outlet for that. So most of that political frustration and anger was pent up, only released occasionally via underground and secret organizations that opposed the ruling regimes. In Egypt, President Obama, he held back. This was during the Arab Spring. He held back and he let Hosni Mubarak fall. And we were all told that something special, something important was going on. But if you looked at the history of Egypt's leadership since the end of the monarchy, it had just moved from one general to the next. And what we were being told was a democratic Arab Spring was really just the military holding back, right? Restraining themselves, letting things run their course for the moment. And what happened? Well, things took their course. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood leveraged its influence and came to power, freaking out a lot of the West. And so that was the end of that. Today, more than a decade later, General Sisi, he's in charge of Egypt, a hardliner, an autocrat who usually lines up with U.S. interest, and he's driving that nation towards disaster, just like his predecessors, other generals, did. For all the change and the promise of Arab Spring, things look just about the same, right? By 2008, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was something just about everyone was regretting as a really poor geopolitical move. So to counter that, a new U.S. leadership under President Obama took basically a hands-off approach to the Middle East. The new president, President Obama, he pushed for a withdrawal from Iraq. He didn't get involved in the upheaval of Egypt and the other so-called Arab Spring countries. So the U.S., after helping to set up the Middle East really poorly for decades, well, it kind of dealt a 1-2 punch in the 2000s. The first punch came and cut off the head of the snake of oppression in Iraq. The overwhelming military might and superiority of the U.S. military topples Saddam Hussein easily, but then to counter that punch, the U.S. disengaged and didn't help stabilize the country or the region. Lofty terms like democracy and self-rule were used as an excuse to disengage from Iraq and refuse the responsibility for anything that followed. And you may be thinking, well, yeah, but that's just Iraq. That's not all of the Middle East. But that's the thing, though. The Middle East, like any other region of the world, it's like an ecosystem. There's a balance of power that has to be maintained. When that balance of power or norms or security, when they're upended, the effects, well, they affect everything else in the region. The fall of Saddam, the withdrawal of the U.S., meant a shift in strategy and assertiveness in Iran, which then triggered a shift in strategy and assertiveness in Saudi Arabia, which changed the priorities of Egypt and Syria, which changed the focus of Turkey, which changed the potential for Yemen and Lebanon. So the vacuum was opened up and things began to shift throughout the region. Arab Spring was part of that, but there was more. Power was up for grabs and the region began percolating with different groups pushing out to take hold of the power or to counter another group's efforts to take hold of that power. This was the period of the upstarts. This was when we see the rise of ISIS. ISIS wasn't the result of the U.S. war in Iraq. It was the result of the debacle of the U.S. war in Iraq and the decades of localized oppression combined to the bungling of the post-war leadership by both U.S. and leading Shiite political parties. We also have to keep in mind that the psychosis of the generation of people who had grown up in the shadow of war there, violence and oppression throughout the region, that would ultimately come to dominate the ranks of ISIS and its leadership. As the U.S. backed away and disengaged from the Middle East, ISIS as it was made up a lot of escaped prisoners from the former Saddam Hussein regime, people who escaped prison. If you look at its history, that's how it came to be formed. But the West kind of looked at it as a joke. That's the way they looked at ISIS. President Obama, he laughed about how they were like the JV squad. He literally had that quote. This ended up being a phrase he regretted as ISIS began routing the Iraqi army, as ISIS advanced in Iraq and other groups, other territories began to gain territory there in the region. It began to stir up in Syria as well. Anyway, so as at first you had a spattering of different Syrian politicians and some of those underground secret political organizations that had quietly chafed under the Assad regime. Well, then these groups begin to merge, right? With groups from Syria began to merge with groups from Iraq, right? People forget how close the Assad regime actually came to being toppled in the early months of the Syrian civil war. This was back when people were still thinking this was all part of the Arab Spring stuff, right? The vice president of Syria, he actually defected. In fact, in late 2011 and into 2012, there was this roster of defectors coming out of Syria from the ruling political elite and into the military's upper ranks. It looked like Assad was about to fall. The rise of ISIS, the instability in Syria, helped fuel the rise of the Kurds. Well, the Kurds have long been an ostracized people group in the Middle East. They were one of the many large groups who got the old proverbial shaft at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. They've been looking for a nation of their own ever since that time. Well, the instability in Syria and Iraq meant they had grounds to fight, on the one hand, for their own protection, on the other hand, to finally pursue their own nation, which should have been theirs all along throughout the years, right? Well, that in turn stirred up Turkey, who is now dealing with both ISIS and Kurdish fighters or within its own borders. In Egypt, I've already mentioned that this was the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood era. Compared to ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood is an old-fashioned political party. But people forget that this was the foundation, the Muslim Brotherhood was. This was the foundation through which a lot of radical or extremist ideology first began spreading throughout the Middle East in the 1970s and onward. Their public face was in Egypt, and it was just another political party. But behind that public persona was this fundamentalist and aggressive ideology that started cracking down on groups in Egypt as soon as the Muslim Brotherhood gained power. This included Christians. It included other people groups who violated Islamic codes according to the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology. In Lebanon, Hezbollah was already highly entrenched there, but with the rise of ISIS, this Shiite group saw the need to rise up and involve themselves in Syria, where ISIS was now making advances after nearly toppling the Iraqi army. When you look to Yemen, the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, certainly helped change out the political leadership there, only to find that generations and decades of grievance from the people combined to government corruption and mismanagement was not going to be fixed with a simple change in leadership. Al-Qaeda had been strong in Yemen for some time, and a violent resistance began to kick up. In fact, Al-Qaeda was active throughout the Middle East during this time, seeking to become a priority benefactor of the vacuums in leadership throughout the region that were popping up. They were quickly usurped by ISIS in Iraq and other parts of Syria. But elsewhere, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was growing in influence, growing in targets and violence. But that's all just the independent actors. Think of a pan of bacon beginning to fry. You have all this sizzle that's just bordering on the precipice of being out of control. These small groups and organizations all over the region. But then you also have the big players, the state actors, coming in to take advantage of the situation as well. The fall of Iraq and the withdrawal of the U.S. meant a more assertive Iran. What few American forces remained in Iraq they reported seeing Iranian arms and even troops at different times throughout this period. Think about that for a minute. Iranian forces and arms in Iraq would have been grounds for war in prior decades, but now it was almost no-holds-barred activity as the different groups, the different actors and states started pushing for power. In Syria, the thing that actually saved Assad, it was intervention from Iran and from Russia. Iran moved heavily into the Syrian conflicts to bolster their man in Damascus. There was no U.S. to stop them. Oh, there were some bombing missions, but it was also almost like the Obama administration had the deliberate tactic of doing as little as possible there in Syria while still being able to refute critics who said they were doing nothing. At one point, rumors were spreading that the Assad regime was using chemical weapons against his own people in Syria. President Obama, he issued a warning. He said, "A red line for us is if we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons being moved around or utilized. That would change my calculus." That's what Obama said. In other words, the U.S. was going to stay out of the fight unless Syria started using chemical weapons. Russia, too, moved in more heavily in the fight, not simply against ISIS, but in support of Assad. Bombing missions and troops arrived to Syria with loads of weapons from Russia. When Assad crossed President Obama's red line, used chemical weapons against his own people to hold on to power, it was the Russians who kept the U.S. from doing anything about it. Now, that's a huge change in the dynamics, the shift in power of the region, and it was a huge blow in what remained of American credibility in the region. In the 1970s, some of President Nixon and Henry Kissinger's most famous moves in the Middle East involved making sure the Soviets didn't get involved there, and the ratcheted up tensions in the Middle East to a World War III scenario. Well, now the Russians were openly involved as the states were bordering upon a disintegration, and the U.S. couldn't do or didn't do or wouldn't do anything about it. The power structures that existed before, they were now collapsing. If Russia and Iran were increasing their interference throughout the region, Saudi Arabia was doing just as much. All right. The biggest difference, of course, was that the U.S. was friendly with Saudi Arabia. So the Western media seldom reported this. Saudi Arabia was active in Iraq and Jordan and Syria, throughout the Middle East, and they weren't active just because they wanted to gain territory. The Saudis were literally starting to freak out because of how aggressive Iran was becoming. They kept waiting for the U.S. to do something, to say something, bomb something. That's what the U.S. always did. Well, where were they now? Even Turkey was getting involved. They were nervous about the Kurds, but they were also nervous about ISIS. They started flying bombing missions into the region. The threat of ISIS unleashed all sorts of justifications for violence and reprisals that would otherwise have been frowned upon by the rest of the world. Never mind that Turkey wasn't just pushing back against ISIS. They were simply against those groups. They seemed a threat to the Turkish leader's Erdogan's power there. Again, the U.S. didn't do a lot about it because it needed a friendly Turkey. So Turkey was allowed to break all sort of standards and rules that would have been in place in the past. Now, you have to keep this all in a frame of reference. By 2014 and 15, we have war spreading throughout the Middle East. There was hardly any country in the region that was not somehow involved in warfare. Ironically, the quietest country in the region was the one that historically had caused the most wars in the region. That was Israel. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Yemen, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman. All throughout the Middle East, there was violence and warfare unfolding. It might not be within one country's border, but that didn't mean they didn't have their people and forces actively engaged in the fighting. This was the time when the trauma, the spectacle of violence, was on full display for all the world to see. In Syria, chemical weapons and barrel bombs were being unleashed. Hospitals and schools were being bombed. The effort seemed focused on unleashing as much damage and chaos and maximize pain upon the civilian population, including children, as possible. ISIS was beheading people on the nightly news. They were crucifying people, literally crucifying people, setting up sex slavery networks with their captives. The king of Jordan, he personally flew a bombing mission over ISIS after one of his officers was filmed being burned alive by these ISIS wackos. The savage brutality was coming to dominate the region and the state of affairs there. Consider this. The two biggest wars of the 21st century by 2015 were those in Iraq and Syria. By 2013, over 500,000 people had been killed in Iraq, the Iraqi war alone. Syria was just at over 400,000 people. That's almost 1 million dead in just these two wars alone. And that doesn't count all the injured. It doesn't count all the traumatized, all those who were psychologically screwed up by what they had seen. These so-called survivors are the ones who would dominate the front lines of the next phase of the conflict. It also doesn't count what was going on in Yemen during this same time period. In Syria, we had barrel bombs and chemical weapons and cluster bombs and chemical weapons that were being used in densely populated civilian areas. And this wasn't just being done by the Assad regime. The biggest problem was that it was being done by both sides. The world couldn't clearly define the good guy or the bad guy of this contest and categorize it all neatly within a format for a plan of action. The victims were easy enough to see, though. Amnesty International reported widespread use of rape and sexual violence used to punish different communities and groups within the Syrian conflict. Kidnapping, torture, mass execution. This was all part of the daily routine. And by 2015, we should have realized that the region was beginning to disintegrate. It was beginning to collapse. The world saw what was happening. We knew it was getting bad, but somehow we kind of thought this would all eventually resolve itself or work its way out. Now, I've touched on this already, but one of the biggest outcomes of 2011 that eventually played out and manifested into the geopolitical reality we see today is the spread of Iranian Shiite influence. The warfare of that period finally began to shift, and it transitioned to a battle between regional powers. That's usually how it works. The powers of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Their ideologies, the basis for their wars and loyalties and violence and merciless bombing, destruction, killing of civilians, it all began to coalesce, to categorize, to compartmentalize into Sunni versus Shia Islam, Saudi versus Iran. So Syria turned into a proxy war. Iraq turned into a proxy war. Yemen especially turned into a proxy war. And this also helped where powers like Russia and the US and even China could distribute their own support, their own resources more efficiently to one side or the other. They didn't have to deal with resistance groups in Syria anymore. They could deal with Iran or they could deal with Saudi Arabia. And that would get things done more efficiently, more effectively. Iranian influence spread into neighboring Iraq. As ISIS finally came under control, Iranian influence moved from Lebanon into Syria and connected in Iraq. And with this active and engaged geopolitical reality of Iran in the Middle East, along with Yemen, Iran had formed what experts called a Shiite crescent. It was a move to dominate the Middle East. Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, during that time, he boasted, "Is it possible to make any important decisions in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, North Africa, and the Persian Gulf region without Iran or Iran's opinion?" Iran was not only winning the regional war, in large swaths of territory with explicit strategic significance, it had already won. Well, that provoked a surge of violence and engagement from the Saudis, who unleashed hell in Yemen. This was going to be like the place where the fight would finally be one or the other, Iran versus Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis did that with U.S. dollars and U.S. weapons there in Yemen. The journalist Jamal Khashoggi, he described in a piece for the Washington Post how the Saudi Arabian war in Yemen is proving to be counterproductive. It was turning the world against Saudi Arabia as the supposed protectors of Islam, as they bombed the most illiterate Arab country in the world to smithereens. the Saudi nation was spending as much as $200 million a day on this war in Yemen. Well, that journalist, Khashoggi, his name might sound familiar. Not long after writing these reports in the Washington Post, reports that were critical of Saudi Arabia, he was captured by Saudi agents in Turkey. He was strangled, then his body was dismembered. That was in 2018. By then, the U.S. policy had become more focused. It was all about opposing Iran. So less than 2 decades after 9/11, U.S. policy in the Middle East was backing Israel and opposing Iran, seemingly at any cost. And amid all this warfare, cholera and other disease epidemics were spreading throughout the region, amplifying the state of collapse over the last decade. Lebanon was teetering on the brink of failed state status. The country was being held together really only by the terrorists and organizations that use its apparatus for their own services, their own devices. That's like Hezbollah. Iraq is not far behind. Same for Yemen. The attacks, we fast forward to the attacks of Hamas on Israel in October 2023. Those were the next steps in the continued descent. And we're still witnessing the fallout from all of that. It's always tricky to look at major events like this and determine how history will remember it. But my money says the attacks of October 2023 by Hamas into Israel, that'll just be the straw that broke the camel's back. The attacks by Hamas were horrendous, but Israel paid back an even worse toll. According to experts, there are somewhere between 20,000 to 50,000 members of Hamas there in Gaza. All right? No one knows for sure how many, but that's the estimates. So after the October 2023 Hamas attacks, Israel strikes back hard. Within the first 100 days, they dropped more than 2 tons of bombs per member of Hamas onto Gaza. Right? One of the most densely populated pieces of land on the planet. That's per square foot. Most densely populated pieces of land on the planet. So the civilian death count obviously soared. Assassinations in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, those all followed. And before long, all of the sympathy and outrage from October 2023, that was just blown, and Israel became a pariah on the world stage. And I guess the question is, what comes next? And we don't know, at least not at the time of this recording. But the trends suggest things are about to get worse. This series, the whole point of this series was to show that the Middle East, it was designed from the very beginning to be fragile. It was designed divided, broken, and it was made to be dependent upon the great powers. But what happens 100 years later when the great powers don't want to play anymore? Well, that's where we are today. Now, granted, this is a pessimistic, maybe you might say a cynical outlook, but I doubt the victims, the individuals that are dying every day, suffering every day in that region of the world, I doubt they would disagree with it.